Hey. Hey. I hope that looks okay on video because I got rug burn doing that. It actually hurt more than it probably should have. Maybe I'm just not that graceful, but I hope that worked out. But I am Andrew LaFleur, the lazy writer, and today is our very first installment of Read to Succeed, where we strive as a group to read every single day. Because if the lazy writer can do it, then so can you. Now, I'm going through the 2018 version of the best American short stories, like I said in my intro video, and I'm linking that in the description if you want to read this along with me. However, if you do not have this and do not wish to get it, that is fine. Read whatever you have on hand. A novel, a book of poems, another collection of short stories, or something online that you can find. And so, yeah, just comment in the comment section what you're reading. If you're reading this along with me, I'd like to know. And if you're reading something else entirely, that's fine. I'd like to know what you're reading. So we are going to try our best to learn something as a writer from this, and also what worked as a reader from a reader's perspective from every short story while we go through it. So like I said, this is the very first installment. So we read the very first short story called Cougar by Maria Anderson. Now, warning, this does contain spoilers for the short story Cougar by Maria Anderson. I'm going to give a basic synopsis of what the story is about. It's about a young man who lives in the kind of the woods with his father in a trailer, and they live a kind of slow life in a very small community. And then one day his father disappears, and that's pretty rough on the boy. It's pretty much, you don't know whether or not the father ran away or the father went to go commit suicide. People kind of think both at the same, they kind of switch what they think it is. And the story is really just about the son dealing with that. I think it's kind of dealing with death and the, you know, the idea your father's gone. What do you do at that point? You're kind of face to face with the idea of death, and also face to face with the idea of becoming a man and having to make your way in the world. And I think the whole story is kind of about that. And I think it's really revolves around this one image, the cougar. It's the namesake of the actual short story, Cougar. Now, I personally think that the cougar is kind of like the representation of death itself. I think in the very beginning of the story, or really close to it, the author says something along the lines of, from the main character's perspective, because the father would always hang out on the front area and just look out into the woods. And at one point it said that the son would speculate whether or not he's just waiting to see the cougar. And then his father soon disappears or dies. And, you know, his father's waiting to see death, maybe. You know, you don't know. It's kind of interesting, but I think that the cougar really does represent the idea of death for I think pretty solid reasoning. But throughout the whole story, the son kind of just ensconces himself in the father's lifestyle. He kind of just stays in the trailer that they lived in, doesn't leave, doesn't really make plans to leave, although there's constantly this friend of his sending him postcards who works on an oil rig, and his friend wants him to join to make $100,000 a year and eventually move to Florida and hang out with women in bikinis. And I live in Florida, and I'll tell you this, we aren't just surrounded by women in bikinis all day, but that's what he wants, right? And that's what his friend wants. But he ends up just working at a Chinese restaurant as a dishwasher, which is a wonderful setting for a novel. It really makes you realize that you can find very ordinary settings and be very, very interesting. And the story continues with his relationship with his landlord, who's his only real neighbor within sight, named Jenny, who's this Native American guy. And it just kind of ends. You're kind of waiting the whole time to figure out what the young man's going to do. Is he going to move on? Is he going to commit to living this lifestyle? And it doesn't really give us an answer. It just ends, and it ends on the image of the cougar. And I think that's actually a pretty powerful image to end on, and I'll get into that in a second. But I'm going to look at my experience as a reader first. I liked it, even though I didn't think I would. I started reading it and I didn't like it because the tone and mood of this whole thing is so melodramatic. It sounds like a poem written by a middle school kid that you find in a locker room. I mean, it is pretty dramatic and melodramatic. I mean, listen to this. This is after his father disappears. He says this: I clicked on the safety, turned the gun around, and swung it from the barrel like a golf club into my ankle. The pain felt like something else in the dark room, dim and sweet, right? Like that's pretty serious, intense, and melodramatic. And the tone is like that throughout the whole freaking thing. So at first I was like, no way, this is too intense for me. Although there are a lot of points of comedy, and I'll get into those. But I'll say this, the tone is consistent throughout the whole thing. It's very consistent. So it won me over in the end. So by the end I got to it, I kind of was okay with the way that kind of intense, melodramatic tone in it that caused this mood. So it won me over. But also what else won me over was the moments of comedy. And the moments of comedy it used the serious tone for the comedy to the greatest effect. So one example would be when they're looking for the father, right? It says, search and rescue never found a body. One member of the search committee, a homeless a-hole there for the free lunch, pulled me aside and told me it was them aliens, and them aliens is in quotes, who took my father, the ones who doodled on all the trees. He pointed at a larch. So like that's funny, right? And most of the comedy comes through the characters and kind of how normal and absurd they are at the same time, right? I think one of the really funny characters is Jenny, the landlord. He's the Native American guy that lives, the only guy within eyesight of the main character's trailer. And he's really funny because this is not funny, but he's like sickly and dying. So he's growing really thin as the story goes on. But he has this ponytail that he kind of likens to a rat tail. And as he grows thinner, this seems like the ponytail is growing thicker. And it's like, he kind of says it's like an alien feeding off of his energy and growing as time goes. So there's comedy in there, but always attached to something kind of sad and intense, right? Like the rat tail is attached to this guy dying. The homeless guy talking about aliens is attached to his father's disappearance. So, but in the end, I liked it. I did really like it. I do kind of wish I had a little bit better of an understanding of what the son would do in the future, but that's not the point of the story, clearly. So it's just me wanting my kind of happy ending, everything tied up in a neat bow. But let's look at what I learned as a reader. So I could look at the characters because I think the characters are probably the strongest point in this short story, but I'm going to look at the imagery because I think there's one very specific way he uses imagery, or she uses imagery, that is really amazing. And what that is she brings up an object or an item or an image earlier in the story in a very casual way and then brings it back, right? And I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. So he starts working at that Chinese restaurant, right? Which is actually owned by Koreans, and one of the best characters in the entire series is the Korean grandmother part of the family who owns it. She's an amazing character. And he starts working there. So there's the image of like Chinese food that's brought up a couple times. But then there's this time that he's looking at his Native American landlord who's sickly and dying, and he references the oily skin under his eyes, the color of chow mein. Looking at it made me hungry, even though I hated chow mein. And yeah, you can tell it's in first person, which adds to that kind of melodramatic tone of it all. But so he references chow mein outside of the Chinese restaurant. And the only reason that the author used chow mein as an image is because the Chinese restaurant is an element of the story already. So there's something introduced and it informs the imagery she uses going forward. There's one more example of this, and it's in the very last scene of the entire story. So, and it revolves around the Korean family. The grandmother, I think it's her husband, she has a shrine to her husband who's died. And when he's fired from the Chinese restaurant, he kicks it over, and there's these clementines that are on there, which are like a fruit, and they roll around. And so there's these clementines. It's mentioned a couple times. And then at the very end of the short story, it says this about the cougar. Remember this reoccurring image of the cougar that lives in the forest? I think it represents death. And it says this: A few nights later, I saw the cougar again. He was walking about 20 feet from my living room toward Jenny's trailer. His eyes were the size of clementines, big black clementines. He was moving slowly, swinging his head low to the ground, looking toward my trailer and away and back again. So yeah, I think that is so interesting, the way the author brought in clementines to help, describe and inform us about the cougar. But the only reason that the author used the clementines as an image is because it was something that was brought in earlier in a much more casual way. It's like a callback to itself, but for almost no reason. It's really interesting, and I think it's really cool. So I'm going to take that as a challenge to start doing maybe something like that in my own work, where maybe the author or the main character is introduced to somebody, and in there they see something about, like, envision whenever an object is introduced to the story, bring it back as an image to describe something else, right? Like that, the clementines, the eyes of the cougar were like clementines, and it makes sense, especially in the first person. And I think that's where, again, it's this person's a really good author because it's the first person, meaning the speaker is saying I went here, I went there, I saw this person do that. Of course, the things that you see in your life would help inform the images that you conjure up in your mind. So the clementine stuck in his head, and then when he sees something later, he sees them like they're clementines. So I think that was a really good technique that we can learn from the author Maria Anderson. There's a lot more I can go on this, but I'm sure this video is going on way too long already. I'm going to do my best to make these shorter and shorter and shorter over time because I want these to be quick videos. Hopefully, I can make them maybe 4 or 5 minutes in the future. Maybe I'll stop giving summaries of the short story and just get into what I can learn and what we can learn as readers and writers. So, like I said, that's it with this. I am the lazy writer, and I'm gone. Bye.